We're honoured that Professor Dawkins has joined us here tonight, and I'm equally delighted that we've convinced our moderator to fly from Sydney to Brisbane to Melbourne just today. His voice will be known to most of you. Our moderator is the irrepressible Robyn Williams, science journalist and broadcaster and host of, among other things, The Science Show on ABC Radio National. Would you please join me in welcoming Robyn Williams?
Thank you. Welcome to the greatest show on earth. Well, the book. I want to do a thought experiment. Now, I understand that it's slightly spoiled by the fact that you've got numbers for seats down the front. But imagine you're the people at the back as well, up top, and there's something like 2,000 people have randomly walked into seats, and there you are. The odds against your choosing just those very seats are unbelievably huge. And if you did an experiment, and for instance you came back every half hour, you went out into Swanston Street and came back and randomly chose seats, how long would it take until you actually got precisely that seating that you've got tonight? And you do the experiment every half hour for 100,000 years, 500,000 years, 1,000,000 years. And as you say in the book, Richard, that's just a short while. Why am I asking you this? Because some of the examples that you give in the book of the way evolution operates, I found really thrilling. Would you tell the story, for instance, of those bacteria and the experiments that went on for 20 years to see whether you had a set of, I think it's 12 lots of bacteria to whom you feed, or not you, but a person doing the experiment, feed glucose to see if you could keep the colonies going and how much they would actually change by mutation.
Well, Robyn, you're talking about the work of Richard Lenski at Michigan State University, but before I talk about that, I can't let you get away with your randomizing experiment quite as easily as that. I mean, in order to get exactly the same pattern of seating, everybody sitting in the same seats twice, I mean, not only would it take millions of years, it would take millions of years to even write out the number of noughts in the odds. I mean, that's not what evolution is about. It's not about long odds of that sort. There may be isolated incidents in the process, such as perhaps the origin of life, which, I don't think this, but some people might argue, have long odds of that sort. But once the evolutionary process gets going, we don't have to talk about long odds like that. I mean, we've got a process that actually guides it.
That's the point.
And so something like making an eye or making a knee joint or something is, if not exactly inevitable, it certainly is not the kind of thing you'd illustrate by a randomizing experiment like that. You might well illustrate the origin of the universe like that. I don't know.
Well, could you illustrate that through the organizing pattern of those very bacteria, which then produce something which has been studied over such a long time?
Well, okay, let's talk about these bacteria of Richard Lenski. The point about bacteria is that, unlike us, who have a sort of generation time of about 25 years, these bacteria, E. coli, have a generation time of, about 25 minutes. And so they get an awful lot more evolution in a human lifetime. So what Lenski did was to set up what I call his 12 tribes of bacteria. He had 12 lineages. Each lineage you could think of as a row of thousands and thousands of flasks filled with glucose and other nutritious substances. And so he inoculated all 12 of the first row of flasks with bacteria drawn from the same population. And then every day he would let these bacteria population grow, and they grew exponentially and then flattened off as they reached saturation. And then it started to become competitive in the flask. And then at the same time the next day, he would draw out a little drop of a fixed amount, a small amount of the liquid containing bacteria, and drop it into the next flask. And there were these 12 tribes, 12 columns of 12 rows of flasks going off into the distance for 20 or 30 years. And what you see under those conditions is evolution. You see that as the generations of flasks go by, and each generation of flasks contains hundreds of generations of bacteria, as the generations of flasks go by, you can draw out samples of the bacteria and look at them, and you watch evolution take place before your very eyes. And all sorts of fascinating things emerged. One was that the 12 tribes all evolved in the same general direction, but different in detail. They all got better at surviving and reproducing in this glucose-rich environment, but they did it in different ways. Another beautiful thing about the experiment is that because bacteria can be frozen and then brought back to life after an indefinite period, he could lay down his own fossil record. So at every stage he could take out a sample of bacteria and deep freeze them. And then he could say much years later, so let's go back and have a look at what it was like in generation 13. Unfreeze them. And then actually compare the ability of generation, say, 20 to run against generation 13. So it's a beautiful experimental system for showing a form of natural selection. It's not artificial selection, it really is natural selection. And it showed all sorts of things. The details are all in the book. I don't think I can go into them now, but it is a beautiful experiment.
Another beautiful experiment involves creatures which are slightly larger, of course, and that is foxes, because the story of dogs is one very close to my heart. They, of course, became domesticated, not because we domesticated them, but we did a deal. They were with us long before, say, 12,000 years ago, when there were towns or even established places to live. However, one of the experiments that was done in, I think it was Siberia, about 50 years ago, and the reason I mention that is one of the scientists involved has actually moved to Armidale in New South Wales, where he's a professor of biology. And what they did was to select the kind of things that we love in dogs, and that is their playfulness, their friendliness, and tell the story about how many generations it took, remarkably short number of generations, to get those characteristics.
Well, not only that. I mean, they selected for tameness. These were foxes being bred for fur. It was fur farming. And they were breeding for tameness, and they systematically bred for tameness. That means that each generation, they would look at the litter of cubs and choose those cubs who were tamest according to some criterion, that they were most readily approaching humans and so on. And it took, I think only about half a dozen generations before they got fairly dramatic results. And after, again, I don't have the figures, but the whole thing only lasted about 30, 40 years. And they got foxes that were so tame that they were right off the scale of the original wild ones. They scored them for tameness, and they divided them into very tame, fairly tame, slightly tame, and wild. After a few generations of artificial selection, they had to invent a whole new category. Extra tame, I forget exactly what they called it.
But they also looked like border collies. They had,
that was the other fascinating
blue
thing.
Eyes and things.
Yeah, the fascinating thing was that having bred for tameness, that then dragged along with it a whole cluster of other characteristics which superficially have nothing to do with tameness, but have a lot to do with looking like dogs. So these foxes not only were tame like dogs, but they looked like, as Robyn says, they looked like border collies. They had patchy black and white coats or floppy ears, tails like dogs. A breeding season shifted to be like dogs. And what this is showing, it's well known from other examples, what it's showing is that when you breed for one thing, inadvertently, without realizing it, you find that you're breeding for a whole lot of other things, because there are associations between the effects of genes. And so almost certainly that's what happened with wolves. I mean, dogs, as you know, are descended from wolves and no other wild canids. But they were at first self-selected for tameness, probably wolves that were most fearless in approaching human habitation were able to take advantage of scavenging around human habitations. And so there was a natural selection. The wolves are kind of selecting themselves for tameness. And they gradually became more dog-like as a result. And the fox experiment showed the same thing being, in a sense, reenacted centuries, millennia later.
Bob Wayne in UCLA has done the genetics of dog. And at one stage he was saying they go back with humans about 100,000 years. Now I think he's come down to about 33,000, which of course is enormous when you consider how long we've been around as modern species. But one of the things, going back to those numbers of complexity, what I was thinking of more to do with the odds of people sitting in chairs like that is the odds of my being like I am and those dogs being like they are. In other words, the uniqueness that is sometimes looked at of something turning out like it does. It's got to turn out somehow. And the one thing that I love about the dog story is neoteny. In other words, what seems to be selecting for there is that playfulness or sociability is a short span in the wolf, but it's far longer in the dog, as we know. Now, there's also an example, another picture in the book, which I found startling because you question whether it was straight, is of the upright, serious-looking young chimp, which looks like on the way to being a neotenous human, you know, that naked ape of your mate Desmond Morris's. Tell us about the picture of the young chimp and what made you wonder whether it was for real.
Well, perhaps we ought to talk about what neoteny is as well. Neoteny is a well-known phenomenon in evolution whereby juvenile characteristics are retained into adulthood. And so, as Robyn says, it looks as though what happened with dogs, and probably what happened with the Siberian foxes too, was that puppy-like characteristics, cub-like characteristics, are retained into adulthood. And so if you select for tameness, what you're inadvertently doing is probably delaying maturity, or, if you like, bringing sexual maturity earlier in life so that juvenile characteristics are still present. And tameness would be one of those juvenile characteristics. And so you get a whole lot of other juvenile characteristics. Now, humans are thought to be neotenous apes, so that it's certainly undeniable that the skull or the head of a baby chimp is far more like an adult human than an adult chimp is like an adult human. Another way to put this, as Aldous Huxley did in a science fiction context, was to suggest that if humans could somehow be allowed to live for, say, 200 or 300 years, we would end up looking like chimps, because we would have grown up. I mean, we are juvenile apes, and we would then grow up. Now, the photograph in the book, it's a famous photograph of an adult chimp and a baby chimp, and the baby chimp photograph is sitting absolutely bolt upright. And it looks very, very human indeed. It looks actually far more human than baby chimps really do. And that's what Robyn's referring to, that it looks as though the photograph kind of doctored. I mean, if not deliberately doctored, it's sort of mounted. The stuffed specimen was mounted in a very, very human way. The point still remains that juvenile chimps are much more human-like than adult chimps. But this particular photograph, which is often used to illustrate the point, probably it's a bit too good to be true.
It's very pretty, though, isn't it? I want to tell you a short story that I broadcast last week, which I found rather delicious. It actually came out of the AAAS meeting in San Diego, and we had a veterinary scientist belonging to the US Navy who had been studying dolphins, and they had a captive colony over 40 years, and they took their physiology systematically and discovered that they had a kind of diabetic reaction. In other words, they had a resistance to insulin. And the point that she was trying to make, and she published a paper on this, is that she was looking for ways to illustrate our own diabetic tendencies. Now, you probably won't be surprised to know that this book reflects various problems we have in our design. The fact that we're diabetic, and so many people are diabetic, is another example of where the design seems to have been frankly flawed. So is there an evolutionary explanation for that? Well, the suggestion was that to explain how the dolphins became that way, resistant to insulin, is that they have a switch. And they had a switch because the ancestors, way back, who may be allied to the ancestors of hippos, which I think surprised you when you looked at that line of things. I always thought it might have been bears, but still, maybe both. That when they went from land into the water 55 million years ago, they turned to fish. In other words, they had more and more protein, less and less carbohydrate, less need for the insulin. And so that brings a kind of parallel to us, strangely enough, who apparently during one of the last ice ages, maybe one going back 20,000 years, we too tended to go only to protein because all the carbohydrate was frozen or something. You can see apparently parallels with Eskimos. And so what they're doing is looking at ways in which this fantastically adaptive system in the dolphin, which can switch in a matter of hours to deal with sugar, could be still somewhere in the software and could be exploited in people to work out ways in which there are parallels. The final example she gave of ways in which we kind of cross over is both have big brains and both need highly packed glucose to be carried in our blood systems. And so the parallels might be even further than expected. Is this one of the delicious things that keeps coming up as you look into the history of different animals, how the parallels keep coming out?
Well, certainly parallels keep coming up. I'm not familiar with that work. Where's that published?
I'm not sure yet, so I shall look it up.
Okay.
But we've got a paper somewhere.
I think there are fascinating parallels, and they are extremely illuminating. And what's one of the benefits of studying evolution, that we can actually learn from things, and the idea of there being software recipes lurking away and ready to be used is a fascinating one. Yes.
Yeah. Two questions on that. One of them is to do with what you said about Darwin. I didn't actually see it so much in this book, but you said there are 5 bridges to greatness in understanding how evolution actually works, and that Darwin probably did 4, but he missed out on the digital revolution, but he nearly got there because he explained that we don't necessarily have blended sexes. In other words, it's one thing or the other. It's 0 or it's 1. It's male or it's female, normally.
Darwin was astonishingly prescient in this. I mean, it's always said that Darwin got everything right except genetics, and he completely ballsed up genetics, which is sort of true. But because he was a man of his time, and in his time people believed in blending inheritance, so they believed that each person, each individual is a kind of mixture of its mother and its father, rather like mixing two substances. And nowadays we know, of course, that ever since Mendel, we've known that it doesn't blend. It's kind of digital in the sense that a gene is either there or it isn't. And then with Watson and Crick and DNA, it's mightily digital. It's digital. Every little detail is digital. Darwin, of course, would have had no conception of that. But what Robyn's referring to is that Darwin came very, very close to getting Mendel's laws. It's always said that Mendel, who got the idea that genes are either there or not there, and showed it with his various experiments on peas and other things, if only Darwin had read Mendel, then he would have got out of a very difficult bind. Because under the laws of blending inheritance, which everybody believed in except Mendel, natural selection couldn't work because there wouldn't be enough genetic variation for natural selection to work on. Under extreme blending inheritance, the variation is halved in every generation, so you'd need massive mutation rates in order to allow selection to take place. Mendel completely solved that, or it was later realized that Mendel had completely solved it. But what's intriguing is that if you look at some of Darwin's unpublished writings, his letters, you see that he came very, very close to it. And he alludes to some experiments that he had done actually on peas, which was Mendel's experimental animal. Plant, well.
Animal, sort of.
Yes. that he'd done some crossing with peas and had got progeny that were either one colour or the other colour, but not halfway between. Now that's got the point, and he then made the point. But this is not in any way more remarkable than the fact that when you cross a male and a female, you don't get a hermaphrodite. You either get a male or a female. So that all one had to do to get Mendel's laws was to say, in the inheritance of sex is just a special case. You either get a male or you get a female, you don't get halfway between. That's the principle that works right the way through genetics.
There have been a few books, well, not many, about where Darwin went wrong. Did he go wrong seriously in certain places?
Well, he did go wrong on genetics, and he was goaded by the very point I've just mentioned, that there's not enough variation for selection to work on. He was goaded in later editions of The Origin of Species to flirt with a form of Lamarckism, various things. He thought that food directly induced mutation. He had rather queer ideas about genetics. And so, yes, he did go wrong there.
I like the way you insist on going by the first edition, because rather like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, there are several editions, and they were kind of yielding to the pressure of the establishment to put by the grace of God here and something else there.
Yes.
To ornament it.
That's right. It's an unusual case, because usually one assumes that the later editions of a book are more up-to-date, more correct. They take account of new findings and so on. Darwin's later editions took account of bad criticisms. And trying to meet these bad criticisms, he made the book worse. So that the first edition is, in many respects, the best edition. And in this one particular case, in the last paragraph, I think it's in the last paragraph, where he's talking about the origin of life and saying, having been originally breathed. In the first edition, he says simply having been originally breathed. In later editions, it becomes having been originally breathed by the Creator.
Yes.
And this was put in, as Darwin himself lamented later in life, was put in actually in response to religious pressure.
So if you think you've caught Richard out by getting the quotation wrong, have a look at the other.
Many people have. I've had furious letters from people. How dare you cut out this key phrase by the Creator?